Welcome, listener. Tonight, we travel not into the heart of a battlefield, or the chambers of power, but into a far more silent and hidden place, a forgotten corridor of history. Tonight, you'll follow the footsteps of those who vanished into one of the harshest and most secretive systems ever constructed, the Soviet Gulag, for millions of prisoners, mostly between the 1930s and 1950s. Daily life in the Gulag wasn't about dramatic escapes or cinematic uprisings. It was about cold, hunger, silence, labor, waiting. It was about surviving, not a day, but 1,000 days, each nearly identical. In a world where the horizon was snow, barbed wire, and the sound of boots crunching on ice. But we won't rush. This is not a tale of urgency. Let this be slow, gentle, a sleepy recounting of the monotonous and punishing rhythms that defined life behind the wire. We'll walk through the frozen mornings, the soup lines, the work details, the long evenings of frost and aching muscles, and finally, the fragile hopes that flickered in darkness. So lie back, get warm, and listen. Let the past unfold gently, like snow settling over a frozen barrack. The train has no windows, only a sliver of light where the wooden boards don't quite meet. You've lost count of how long you've been inside. Maybe 10 days, maybe 15. Time doesn't move inside these rail cars. You're packed in with strangers, men you don't know, each staring at the floor, their breaths steaming in the stale air. The smell inside the car is thick, old sweat, urine, and despair, all blended together, clinging to the walls. There's a rusted metal bucket in one corner, the only place to relieve yourself. A few dry crusts of bread were tossed in sometime yesterday, or was it the day before? Hunger dulls memory. No one speaks anymore. They did in the first few days. Names, stories, why they were arrested, counter-revolutionary thought, or stealing a pair of boots. Some were told they'd only be gone for a few months. Some knew better. But as the train rattled deeper into the Siberian wilderness, the words dried up. What was the point? Now there's just the creaking of wheels, the cold seeping in under the doors, and the constant, aching question, how far can this place be? And then, one early morning, it stops. Guards begin shouting. The door slides open with a scream. Blinding white light floods in. The cold punches your skin like a slap. You blink, squinting at a landscape so flat, so pale, it seems more like a dream than a place. Snow, birch trees, a wooden platform, a truck idling nearby. Out, move. You climb down slowly. Your legs ache from disuse. You stumble. A guard shoves you with the butt of his rifle. Around you, dozens of others are doing the same. Eyes down, lips blue, hands shaking, each carrying a bundle, if anything at all. This is not a welcoming committee. A watchtower looms ahead, its silhouette black against the pale sky. A tall wooden fence of vertical logs marks the edge of the camp. Inside, rows of squat, snow-covered barracks huddle close together, smoke drifting from a few chimneys. It smells of wet wood, old ash, and something metallic, like rusted nails and worn-out steel. A roll call is taken. You don't recognize your own name at first. Not the way they pronounce it. You mumble here and step forward. A guard scribbles something on a clipboard. You're handed a canvas sack, your only belongings now. A torn blanket, a tin cup, maybe an extra pair of wool socks if you're lucky. The first step inside the camp is strange. Not terrifying, just empty. Like a school after all the students have gone home. The cold is different here. It bites not only the skin, but the soul. It's too quiet. No birds, no laughter. No dogs barking in the distance, just the crunch of boots on snow, and the occasional creak of wood from buildings straining in the wind. The barracks are dim. You're shown to your assigned bunk. Second level, wooden slats, no mattress, just straw. The man above you is already asleep, or pretending to be. No introductions. You pull your blanket around your shoulders and sit, staring at the floorboards. The stove in the corner glows faintly. A prisoner feeds it with small sticks, trying to stretch the last of the fuel. Others huddle nearby, their hands stretched toward the weak heat. One man coughs repeatedly. No one moves to help. There are rules, though you haven't been told them. You'll learn fast. Speaking after lights out, standing too long, sleeping too much, eating too slow. Each infraction is met with punishment. Sometimes a beating, sometimes worse. And so you sit, still wearing your coat, still not sure if you're dreaming. And then the door opens again. Another group enters. Their faces are just as hollow. The process repeats. A bell rings in the distance. It's not even noon, but it's time for your first work detail. A guard barks orders. You follow the line out into the snow. No one told you what the work will be. No one tells you when it ends. But already, something inside you has changed. You're not hoping for rescue. You're hoping for a decent pair of boots. The bell doesn't chime like a school bell. It groans, a long iron clang that feels like it echoes through your bones. You're not even sure what time it is. It's still completely dark outside. The barracks are filled with the muffled rustling of fabric, creaking wood, and quiet groans. No one talks. Everyone just moves. You pull on your coat, damp from yesterday's snow, and reach for your boots, which you left under the bed. They're stiff with ice. You shove your feet in anyway. The cold bites. There's a hole in the right sole, and snow seeps in before you've even stood up. You tie them anyway. It doesn't matter. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is served quickly. A watery broth made from barley husks, cabbage remnants, or sometimes just hot water with a trace of grease floating on top. You line up in silence, tin cup in hand, and receive your ladleful. A slice of bread follows, dense, grayish, and dry. You're supposed to eat slowly, but hunger makes that impossible. And once it's gone, it's gone. No seconds, no discussion. The guards shout again. Everyone gathers outside the barracks in tight rows, breath clouding the air like smoke from a train engine. You're counted once, twice, 3 times, because the numbers never add up the first time. A mistake means standing longer in the cold. Eventually, they're satisfied, and assignments are called out. You're placed on a logging crew today. You don't know what that means yet, but you're marched toward the edge of the forest. A long walk, made harder by the fact that the snow comes up past your ankles and your boots leak. The wind slices sideways through your coat, and your fingers go numb even inside your sleeves. No one complains. Complaining can earn you time in the punishment cell. Or worse, a lost ration. When you reach the worksite, it's just snow, trees, and a few rusted tools. Axes, saws, shovels. A guard paces nearby with a rifle slung over his shoulder. Another prisoner, older and thinner, explains the task without emotion. Cut down as many trees as possible, limb them, stack the logs by size, then carry them back toward the sled path. Simple, repetitive, endless. Your axe is dull. It takes several swings just to make a dent in the frozen bark. The wood resists, each blow vibrating through your arms, jarring your spine. Your breath comes in short bursts, and within minutes your back begins to ache. But you can't stop. Stopping draws attention. Stopping means someone notices, so you keep swinging. Every once in a while, someone collapses. No ceremony, no medical attention. If they can stand again, they're shouted at to return to work. If not, they're dragged aside and left until the guards decide what to do. You've already seen it happen twice. One man vomited and passed out. Another simply sat down and refused to move. His fate. You don't ask. The hours stretch on. Time has no shape out here. No clocks, no sun, just the feel of muscle and bone grinding through repetition, and the growing sensation that you're part of a machine, not even a cog, more like the grease on the cog, necessary, but easily replaced. At some point you're given a lunch break, another line, another ladle. This time it's thin soup with a few shreds of potato skin and cabbage. Some days there's a cube of horse meat or a sprinkle of buckwheat. You eat squatting in the snow, your fingers barely able to hold the cup. It freezes to your lips if you're not careful. There's no time for rest. Soon, you're back at the axe, swinging, sweating, freezing, aching. When the bell finally groans again in the distance, signaling the end of the shift, your body barely responds. It's too tired. Your arms shake as you hand over your tool. Your legs stumble as you fall into line for the march back. No one speaks. By the time you return to the barracks, it's full dark. The weak glow of the stove draws people like moths. You join them, not because it helps, but because it's instinct. Warmth means life, even if it's only symbolic. Dinner is no better than breakfast. Maybe half a potato this time. Your body screams for calories, for salt, for something hot and solid. But hunger is part of the uniform here. Everyone wears it. You collapse into your bunk. There's straw poking through your coat, the smell of feet and smoke and unwashed bodies all around. The man in the bunk above you coughs again, deep, rattling, like something inside him is breaking apart. There's no pillow, no comfort, just the numb heaviness of fatigue. Outside, the wind picks up again. You close your eyes, and tomorrow, will begin before the sun rises. The barracks were supposed to be shelter. That's what the word meant. Something between you and the wind, a place to sleep, to rest, to recover. But the reality was different. In the Gulag, the barracks were just another layer of punishment, drawn out over hours of darkness and aching limbs. You wake up stiff, and not just from the labor. The wooden bunk you sleep on is hard, with straw that has long since lost its cushioning and has begun to break down into itchy dust. Your blanket is thin and barely covers your legs when you curl up. There's no pillow, no sheets. You're wrapped in your coat, boots still on, because taking them off would only mean waking up with frozen toes. Around you, bodies move in slow, broken rhythms. There are 8 men in your small corner, and dozens more beyond that, stacked like sardines on wooden frames. Everyone smells the same, unwashed, sour, heavy. The air is thick with it, sweat, dirt, mold, and the faint sharpness of sickness. The stove in the middle of the room gives off barely enough heat to warm your hands if you stood right beside it. The guards keep it low on purpose. Coal is rationed. Heat is not a right. It's something you have to earn through obedience. And the lice. You can't forget the lice. They crawl under your collar, into your seams. You scratch in your sleep, which only makes it worse. Some prisoners boil their clothes once a week to kill the bugs. Others just resign themselves to the constant itch. You try not to think about what's crawling on you, especially when you lie still in the dark. The structure itself is crude. Timber walls, with gaps between the logs that let in the wind. You can hear it howl through the cracks at night, whistling like something alive. Snow piles against the outer walls and sometimes leaks in, forming a thin crust on the inner floor that never quite melts. Rats scurry in and out freely, occasionally climbing onto bunks in search of crumbs. There's one small, cracked window near the ceiling. It doesn't open, and it doesn't do much except show you the difference between dark and very dark. When snow builds up on the outside, even that vanishes. You lose all sense of time, other than the rhythm of the guards and the groan of the bell. Your barrack has a latrine bucket in the corner. It fills quickly at night, especially in winter when no one wants to go outside to the frozen pit toilets. It reeks, but you get used to it. The nose dulls eventually, just like your sense of taste, or the nerves in your fingers. There's no privacy. Conversations happen in hushed tones, if at all. Trust is rare, and everyone assumes someone is an informant. People talk in code, or not at all. Eye contact is avoided. Some men sing quietly to themselves, half lost in memory. Others pray in whispers before sleep. Orthodox chants or Yiddish laments, depending on who they were before they became a number. You've heard stories about poets here, scientists, soldiers, farmers, people who wrote something wrong, said something wrong, or were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some were reported by jealous neighbors or political rivals. Others never knew why they were arrested. The charges were vague: anti-Soviet activity, sabotage, bourgeois sympathies. Some had actual crimes, many did not. You wonder who you would have been, outside these walls. A teacher, maybe, a tailor, a father. But that's not useful thinking. The barracks don't encourage hope. Hope is dangerous here. At night, when you lie back down, the silence is thick, broken only by the wheezing coughs of the sick, the occasional shifting of weight, or the faint groan of someone having a dream, or a nightmare. The man beside you sometimes mutters names in his sleep. You don't ask who they are. No one talks about home. Home is a weight too heavy to lift. Sometimes someone dies in the night. It's not always noticed right away. A still body under a thin blanket isn't unusual. But if the person doesn't move by morning, someone gives a nod to the guard. The corpse is removed without ceremony. The space is empty for maybe a day. Then someone new takes it. There's always someone new. You might get a letter once a month. If you're lucky. Censored, of course. Pages with thick black lines through anything sensitive. You're allowed to write back, too, though your words are measured and reviewed. You can't say how bad things are. You don't want your family to get into trouble, so you lie. The food is fine. The work is hard but fair. I'm in good health. You're not. But what would honesty change? One day blends into the next in the barracks. The darkness, the cold, the smell, the silence. It becomes normal. Not comfortable. Never that, but familiar. It's not rest, and it's not peace. It's simply the pause between one labor shift and the next. Between one punishment and the next. Between who you were and who you're becoming. In the Gulag, labor wasn't about productivity. It was about control. You wake in the dark. Again, there's no real dawn here. Not in the depths of winter. Just a gradual lightening behind a sky thick with snow and coal smoke. The guards shout. Boots thump the wooden floors. A handful of men groan from bunks but don't rise. They're sick, or dying, or dead. The rest of you move without question. You grab your coat, stiff from sweat and frost, and strap it closed. Your boots are wet from yesterday's melt. The leather cracked, the soles are worn thin, and when you step, you can feel the frozen ground beneath. You wrap a rag around one foot to keep the snow from biting your skin. You don't eat breakfast yet, not before work. First, the roll call. You stand in lines, always too long, always in the cold. Some prisoners faint while standing, others sway with closed eyes, muttering under their breath. The guards count slow, deliberate. If someone is missing, everyone waits until they're found or accounted for. Sometimes that means searching the barracks again. Sometimes it means dragging a body out from under a bunk. When the numbers line up, the gates open. You march. The walk to the labor site can take an hour, sometimes more. Your legs grow numb within the first 20 minutes. The wind slices through your coat, across your cheeks, under your scarf. You keep your eyes down to avoid snowblindness. And because making eye contact with a guard could be misread as defiance. Your job today is digging, not for any real construction, just more roadwork, clearing frozen soil for tracks that may or may not be used. It doesn't matter. The project's purpose isn't important. It's about work quotas. You're given a shovel, sometimes a pickaxe if you're lucky. The soil is frozen several feet deep, and chipping it takes hours. Your hands blister, then freeze, then numb. If you slow down, a guard will shout. If you fall behind the quota, so many cubic meters per day you'll be punished. You might lose food, or privileges, or worse. You remember the first time you saw someone collapse in the pit, a young man, maybe 20, maybe less. He slipped into the trench and didn't get up. The guards didn't stop work. 2 other prisoners were ordered to drag him aside and cover him with a coat. He was dead by the time they finished their quota. You don't think about that anymore, or you try not to. Sometimes the work changes. In spring, there's logging, cutting trees and dragging them through thick wet mud. In summer, mining, crawling through tight tunnels and suffocating heat. But winter is the hardest, not just because of the weather, but because the body is weaker from months of underfeeding. You burn calories faster than you can replace them. Your arms ache before the first hour passes. Your back burns, your knees tremble. But you keep moving. The guards watch everything. Some are brutal, others just bored. A few are barely older than you and just as scared. Most don't speak. They carry rifles and batons and use them both. Sometimes, though rarely, you're rewarded. A hot bowl of kasha, an extra slice of black bread. Once, you were given a dried fish, hard as wood, salty as tears. You chewed it slowly, eyes closed, letting it soften on your tongue like a feast. There are moments of silence in the labor camps, when snow falls softly, muffling the sound of picks and shovels. When the forest groans under the weight of ice, when even the guards go quiet. You treasure those. They're rare, but they remind you of something outside this place, something more human. But then the whistle blows again, and the silence ends. At noon, you're allowed to stop. For lunch, if it can be called that, a watery soup, maybe cabbage or a thin slice of potato floating in it, a piece of bread, if you're lucky, a spoonful of grain. You eat quickly, squatting in the snow, your hands stiff, your breath steaming from your mouth. The soup warms you for maybe 10 minutes, then it's gone. You go back to work. The afternoon drags on in aching limbs and slowing breath. Sometimes you hallucinate, see shadows where there are none, imagine voices whispering in the wind. You shake your head and keep digging. To stop is to risk everything. Finally, just before dark, you're marched back. The walk home is slower. The line of men sags and breaks. Some stumble, some lean on others. Sometimes a man doesn't make it back. If he falls and can't rise, he's left behind until a sled can come retrieve him, dead or alive. Back in the barracks, you peel off layers, your hands shaking. You sit, you eat, the same watery gruel. You say nothing. No one talks much after labor. There's nothing to say, and then sleep, or something like it. Curled on your bunk, body aching, stomach growling, you pull the thin blanket over your head and try not to dream. You'll do it all again tomorrow. In the Gulag, hunger was not an event. It was the atmosphere you breathed, the background hum of every hour, the companion that clung to your bones. Hunger wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a presence that shaped how you thought, how you moved, how you related to others. The day began hungry. The weak tea and thin soup offered in the morning barely coated the stomach. It might contain a shred of cabbage, if the kitchen was lucky, or if the guards were watching. Most often, it was just warm water with a grayish tint, served in chipped enamel cups, passed around by fellow prisoners. You drank it anyway, clutching it for warmth more than nourishment. You swallowed slowly, pretending it was thicker, heavier, maybe with a sliver of fat floating in it, a fantasy you never voiced aloud. Everyone was always hungry, even the men who had been there for years, with faces drawn tight over sharp cheekbones. Stomachs collapsed into their spines. They too watched the food bowls as though something more might appear, but nothing ever did. Rations were supposed to be assigned according to your labor category. If you met the full work quota, you received the full ration, around 1,200 to 1,400 calories. That's barely enough for survival in such bitter cold and physical exertion. But most prisoners didn't meet their quotas. Not because they were lazy, but because the work was impossible. Digging through permafrost or hauling logs uphill on frostbitten feet made quotas little more than sadistic jokes. So you received less, 800 calories, maybe 600, sometimes less. You noticed the weight loss not just in your body, but in how you saw the world. In your first month, you still noticed birds, the rare ones that flitted near the fence line. You thought about music, you remembered old books, old conversations. But hunger strips those things away. Now you noticed bread crusts on the floor. You tracked where other men stashed food. You learned to scrape your bowl clean with a sliver of bark or a torn label from a can. In the black market that existed within the camp's shadows, food was currency. A spoonful of flour could be traded for a button, a piece of fat for a pair of dry socks. Sometimes men sold their tools, even their own coats, for a handful of dried fish. It wasn't uncommon to see a man walking bare-chested in sub-zero weather, because he exchanged his jacket for a piece of stale black bread. You'd have done the same. Stealing food was dangerous, but it happened. A few men learned how to bribe kitchen workers, often other prisoners themselves, with favors, secrets, or scraps of tobacco. Others tried to sneak extra bread during distribution. But if caught, punishment was swift. Solitary confinement, beatings, a further reduction of rations. You'd lose everything. One day you saw a man risk it. During dinner, as the bowls were being handed out, he reached for an extra piece of bread. His fingers barely brushed it before the guard noticed. Without a word, the guard struck him with the butt of his rifle. The man crumpled. The bread landed in the snow, uneaten. Nobody helped him. They were too afraid, and too hungry. That night the man didn't return to the barracks. The bread, it stayed on the ground for hours. No one dared take it. But by morning it was gone. Whether by animal or man, no one could say. Some prisoners tried to supplement their meals with anything they could find. In the forested camps, you could sometimes find bark or moss. Men boiled it into foul-tasting stews. It did little, but the chewing distracted the mind. In the summer, a few dared to trap frogs or dig up roots. It was risky, not just because it broke rules, but because many plants were poisonous. You had to know the land. Most did not. Then there were the rats. They lived in the barracks, fat and bold. Some prisoners fashioned traps, snares, even poisoned bait. The meat was stringy, greasy, and repulsive, but it was meat. You closed your eyes when you chewed. You told yourself it was rabbit, or chicken, or nothing at all. The most desperate moments came when the bread ran out. That was when you saw what hunger could truly do. Men begging others for crumbs, men scraping the bottoms of pots with broken fingernails. Once, you saw a man lick a spoon left behind in the snow, long after it had been used. You were that man. There was no shame in it, not really. Everyone was the same, gaunt, pale, eyes sunken, hands trembling, skin loose and yellowish. Hunger didn't just haunt the stomach, it altered your mind. You began to think constantly about food. You dreamed of it. Your memories became flavored. Soup from home, roast meat from your mother's table, the crust of a holiday pie. You tasted them in your sleep. When you woke, the ache was worse. Sometimes, rumors spread about food deliveries. A train was coming, a new ration shipment. But these were mostly lies, or cruel jokes told by guards. And so you kept moving, working, enduring, because to stop, in the Gulag, meant starvation. When the day's labor finally ended, after 10 or 12 hours of backbreaking work, the prisoners returned to their shelters. The word barracks might conjure images of orderly wooden buildings, perhaps cold but at least solid. But in the Gulag, barracks were often little more than rotting wooden huts slapped together with warrior haste, drafts whistling through the planks, the floors caked with mud, snow, and the stink of damp wool. Each barracks held dozens, sometimes over 100 men, jammed together on wooden bunks, stacked 2 or 3 levels high. There were no mattresses, only rough wooden planks, or, if you were lucky, a layer of straw that hadn't yet molded. Lice thrived in the bedding, crawling across skin as you tried to sleep. You never got used to them. You scratched until you bled. Sometimes prisoners would strip naked at night just to crush the lice between their fingernails, a grim, nightly ritual shared in silence. There was no privacy in the barracks. Every bodily function, every argument, every whispered prayer was shared with the room. The smell was overpowering, a mix of unwashed bodies, damp clothing, stale bread, human waste, and the sharp tang of fear. Windows, if they existed at all, were small and often broken, covered with rag or paper. Snow drifted in. Sometimes the wind howled through a crack in the roof. You'd lie in your bunk and watch your own breath in the air, curling up like a ghost trying to escape. The stove was the center of the room, both literally and spiritually. It was the only source of heat, a squat metal oven that sputtered and coughed smoke more than warmth. On some nights, when there was wood, a weak fire might take hold. The men would huddle around it, sharing warmth and silence, watching each other with hollow eyes. On other nights, the stove remained cold. Fuel was scarce, and the guards didn't care if prisoners froze. Sometimes they denied wood altogether as punishment, not for anything done recently, just to remind everyone of who held the power. You learned to layer your clothing, never taking it off, even to sleep. Scarves, if you had one, were tied around your face. Socks were wrapped over hands, sleeves tucked into pant legs. Even then, the cold found its way in. Fingers stiffened. Toes ached with that bone-deep burn that warned of frostbite. You didn't dare take off your boots, not just because of the cold, but because you feared they'd be stolen in the night. In the Gulag, theft was a constant threat. Men would steal your belt, your spoon, your gloves. Not out of malice, but out of the same desperation you carried in your own chest. Nighttime in the barracks was a strange blend of exhaustion and tension. You were too tired to speak, too hungry to dream, too cold to sleep, and yet you tried. You curled into yourself, listening to the coughs around you. Tuberculosis was rampant. Someone was always coughing, a wet hacking sound that echoed off the beams. You tried to ignore it, just as you ignored the muffled sobs of the newcomer 3 bunks over, or the rustle of someone rummaging through your coat in the dark. Sometimes, the guards came at night. Their boots were unmistakable, heavy, deliberate, crunching over snow, and then creaking on the wooden floors. The door would swing open, letting in a rush of icy air and a gust of fear. They'd call out a name, always just one. Everyone would stiffen, listening. The chosen man would rise slowly, sometimes not even bothering to put on his coat. What was the point? If it was a punishment, the cold would find him anyway. If it was a transfer, he might never return. You didn't ask questions, you didn't say goodbye. Some nights were quieter. Someone might tell a story, murmured low enough not to attract attention. Memories of home, of a wife's voice, of a mother's soup, of a song half remembered from childhood. These fragments felt like treasures, passed around like contraband. They reminded you that a world existed outside the fences. Letters, when they arrived, were lifelines, but they were rare and heavily censored. You could write one every month or so, carefully watched by a guard. Most of your words would be blacked out. You couldn't mention the cold, or the hunger, or the beatings. You wrote, "All is well. I am working. I miss you." You hoped your family could read between the lines. Receiving a letter was like finding sunlight. Men would clutch the paper in trembling hands, rereading each word dozens of times, until the ink smudged and the paper tore. It reminded you that you hadn't been forgotten, that someone, somewhere, still spoke your name aloud. But most nights, there were no letters, no stories, just the dark, and the cold, and the shallow breath of men pressed together in uneasy sleep. And tomorrow, it would begin again. In the Gulag, hunger wasn't just a sensation, it was a way of life. A dull, ever-present ache that curled up inside your belly and stayed there. You didn't eat to feel full, you ate to avoid collapsing, and even that wasn't guaranteed. Rations were the central currency of survival, more valuable than rubles, more sacred than words. Every man measured his day not in hours, but in calories. If you worked well according to the quota, you earned a so-called full ration, but that term was deceptive. The full ration was hardly enough to keep a laborer alive, and many days you fell short of the required output and received only partial food. A punishment ration, a starvation ration. A typical breakfast was a slice of black bread, not soft or fresh, but hard, dense, and sour with age. Sometimes it was moldy, sometimes it was frozen solid, and you had to suck on it until it thawed in your mouth. Alongside the bread might be a ladle of watery soup, more accurately described as cabbage-flavored water. You could count the vegetables on one hand. Potatoes were rare. Meat was a miracle. Often, you stared into your tin bowl and found nothing but murky liquid with a few grayish specks drifting lazily along the surface. Lunch might include more of the same. Watery gruel, thin porridge, maybe a spoonful of boiled millet. The millet clumped into lumps like gravel and stuck to your teeth. It was barely digestible, and often riddled with tiny rocks or husks. You learned to chew slowly. You learned to swallow even when your stomach rebelled. Hunger had no dignity. You ate because you had to, even when it hurt. Some prisoners learned to stretch their bread rations. They would hide half for later, gnawing on it secretly before bed. Others couldn't wait. The hunger was too sharp, too immediate. Fights broke out over crumbs. A stolen crust could mean a beating, or worse, a reduction in ration or solitary confinement, and yet men still risked it. Hunger made you bold. It made you stupid. It made you desperate. You thought about food constantly. Not just the food in front of you, but the food you used to eat. Your mind wandered back to thick slices of buttered rye, to warm stews that steamed in your mother's kitchen, to sausages frying in fat, to the sweet burn of vodka on a winter night. Memory played cruel tricks. Sometimes you could smell those meals, even though they were 1,000 miles and 100 lifetimes away. Some men broke. You saw it in their eyes. The way they stared at another man's spoon, their fingers twitching, lips moving silently. They talked to themselves. They chewed invisible meals. Pica was not uncommon. Prisoners ate coal, rags, even dirt, hoping to fill the emptiness inside, but the ache never left. It simply grew quieter. More familiar. There was a black market in every camp, an underground economy where everything had a price. Bread could be traded for cigarettes, tobacco for a better bunk, or a favor. Some men sold their bodies, others traded their ration for one night of warmth near the stove. These were quiet negotiations, done in whispers and glances. Guards looked the other way, sometimes even participated. Morality frayed fast when survival was on the line. Occasionally, you were assigned kitchen duty, a coveted position, not because the work was easy, but because it gave you access to leftovers. A dropped potato skin, an extra ladle scraped from the bottom of the pot. Kitchen workers learned to steal with sleight of hand. They could hide a crust in a sleeve, palm a bean in a handshake. It was dangerous. If caught, punishment was swift. But it was also one of the few ways to gain an edge in the game of endurance. Hunger also created hierarchies. Older prisoners, or those who had been there for years, knew how to survive. They'd perfected the art of slow eating, of hoarding, of bribery. Newcomers didn't stand a chance. They gobbled their rations too fast, vomited them back up, or wasted energy they couldn't afford to lose. You learned quickly, or you died slowly. Despite everything, mealtime was still a moment of pause. Prisoners lined up with dented bowls and battered spoons, eyes fixed on the pot. Steam rose like a dream. Men shuffled forward, silent, hands trembling. And for a few minutes, as you sat cross-legged in the snow or on a dirty floor, lifting food to your lips, the world shrank to one single purpose: eat, chew, swallow, live. The guards sometimes watched, amused. They smoked their cigarettes, boots dry and bellies full. Occasionally one would toss a crust on the ground and watch the prisoners scramble like dogs, like rats. You tried to keep your dignity, but you were starving. And dignity meant nothing to an empty stomach. Evenings were worse. The cold returned, and the hunger gnawed anew. You lay in your bunk, wrapping your coat tight around your ribs, hoping to fall asleep before your body noticed the absence of food. But it always did. Your dreams were filled with tables, plates, smells that made you weep. And then morning came, and you began again, day after day. Hunger without end. If hunger was the shadow that followed every prisoner, labor was the weight chained to their back, heavy, unrelenting, and inescapable. The Soviet Gulag wasn't merely a place of exile. It was a vast engine of forced production. Prisons became factories, camps became quarries, forests and construction zones. And the men and women inside, they became tools, expendable and replaceable. Work began before dawn. It didn't matter if it was summer or winter, rain or ice. A whistle would scream into the bitter dark, jolting you from restless sleep. You had a few minutes, maybe 10, to rise, dress, and stumble outside. If you moved too slowly, a boot or club might encourage you. Discipline was rarely spoken. It was enforced with fists. The work assignments varied by camp, but none of it was easy. In the forests of Siberia, prisoners were made to fell trees with dull axes and rusted saws, working in deep snow and sub-zero temperatures. Your fingers went numb quickly, and then they just hurt. You'd be tasked with cutting and dragging entire trees, sometimes by hand, because the machinery either didn't exist or had long since broken down. Splinters, frostbite, and shattered joints were common, but still you worked, or you lost your ration. In the vast copper and gold mines of Kalama, you climbed into freezing pits before the sun rose and stayed there until it dipped again behind the mountains. You picked at icy earth with bent tools, shoveling rock into wheelbarrows, hauling it up slippery slopes. The rock dust filled your nose, your lungs. You coughed all night, but you learned to keep quiet. Complaints were punished, warnings were ignored. Railroads were laid across frozen wilderness with the hands of prisoners. No gloves, no machines. Just bodies pushing wheelbarrows through slush and snow, lifting rails heavier than men. Each steel bar had to be moved into place by teams of 6 or 7, straining, groaning, breaths steaming in the air. If one person collapsed, the others suffered. It bred resentment. It bred silence. Everyone feared being the weak link. There was no consideration for age or health. A 60-year-old man might be sent into the mines with the same quota as a 20-year-old. If you failed to meet your target, a certain number of cubic meters dug or trees cut or stones hauled, your food would be cut the next day. No excuses. And the system was designed that way, gradually, over time, to wear you down. Fatigue accumulated like snow. It wasn't sudden, it seeped into your bones. First you noticed the way your legs trembled after a shift, then the pain in your back that never quite went away. Then your fingers stopped bending fully. Then you began falling asleep while standing. Some men dropped dead mid-swing. Their hearts simply stopped. Others slumped quietly to the ground, unnoticed by the guards until the trucks came to haul bodies away. The guards didn't care. They were under orders to maximize output, not protect the laborers. If one man collapsed, another would take his place. Prisoners weren't seen as human. They were units of production, figures on a spreadsheet, fuel for the 5-year plans. The Gulag wasn't a punishment, it was a strategy. Occasionally you'd hear of accidents, cave-ins, equipment failures, explosions, but no investigation followed. The camp simply recorded the dead and replaced them. Wooden crosses might mark the shallow graves, or maybe not. Often, the snow buried the memory before the name was even written down. Sundays were supposed to be rest days, but work often continued, unofficially. Special projects, quota catch-ups, punishments. There was always something to do, and if a high-ranking visitor was expected, a party inspector, a regional boss, the prisoners would be ordered to work up, not for higher pay of course, just for show. Work became a rhythm, not a purpose, not a pride, just a numb, mechanical movement of limbs, over and over. You didn't think, you didn't reflect, you kept your head down. The sound of pickaxes became the song of survival. The crunch of snow under heavy boots, the barked orders of guards, the groan of sleds pulling timber. This was your symphony. In time, you began to lose the concept of rest. Even when you weren't working, your body felt like it was. Muscles twitched at night. Your hands remained curled around invisible shovels. You dreamed of lifting, digging, carrying. You woke sore. You woke exhausted. The rest was never enough. The work never ended. And still, for many, work was a refuge. Not from pain, but from madness. Moving kept you sane. It gave your mind a wall to lean against. In the crushing repetition, there was a kind of stability. If you kept working, you didn't have to think about the years ahead, or the family you might never see again, or the winter that would surely kill your cellmate. You just worked. You survived. One day, then the next, until your body failed, or your sentence ended, whichever came first. Punishment in the Gulag wasn't a warning, it was a performance, a ritual, a way to remind every prisoner that their body no longer belonged to them, that their suffering was not a consequence, but a tool of the system. There were many ways to step out of line. You might whisper something deemed unpatriotic. Maybe you failed to meet your labor quota for a week in a row. Perhaps you were late for roll call, or caught trading rations with another inmate, or simply looked too long at a guard. Sometimes no offense was needed at all. The commandant just needed an example to be made. The punishments varied, but none were mild. One of the most feared was the penal cell, a bare, lightless box of frozen concrete where inmates were locked for days or even weeks. The cell was small enough that you couldn't stretch out. It was damp, the floor often coated with frost. A slit in the door allowed for bread and water to be pushed through. No hot food, no blankets, no toilet. Prisoners crouched in corners like wounded animals, bodies shivering, teeth chattering, slowly losing their minds in the dark. Some were put into these isolation cells during the heart of winter. Temperatures dropped to -40°C or worse, and the guards would laugh as frost crept along the walls and prisoners screamed for mercy. There was no mercy. And if you survived, you came out broken, silent, changed. Then there was Kaza, a cold punishment box made of wood or steel, just big enough for one person to stand. You couldn't sit, couldn't move. The walls would close in on you after only a few hours. Prisoners left in Kaza for 24 or 48 hours would sometimes emerge with muscle spasms, their legs unable to support them, their minds fractured. But it wasn't always just hours. Sometimes it was days. Beatings were common. Routine, you might be struck with a rifle butt or a whip made from wire and rubber. Some guards used belts, clubs, or simply their fists. The violence was rarely personal. It was methodical. Part of the day's work, a punishment report would be filed later, justifying the wounds as disciplinary necessity. If you died during a beating, there'd be a form for that too. For those labeled as political agitators or persistent offenders, there were harsher measures still. Forced exposure, men and women stripped of clothing, left tied to posts in the snow for hours at a time, their feet purple with frostbite, their lips turning blue. Sometimes, prisoners were forced to kneel on sharp gravel for hours, their knees bleeding through their thin trousers, their bodies locked in contorted shapes. If you collapsed, you were beaten. If you cried, they mocked you. And if you resisted, you simply vanished. Public punishments were used to maintain order. A prisoner might be beaten in front of the work brigade. Others forced to watch as someone was dragged into the punishment cell. It sent a message. This could be you. It worked. Fear did what logic never could. It kept people in line, even when all sense of justice was long dead. But some punishments didn't leave bruises. Privilege removal was one of the quietest and cruelest. A slightly larger bread ration, the right to receive a letter, a thin coat for winter. These were the things that gave a prisoner hope. To lose them, even temporarily, was like cutting away a part of your will to survive. Then there was extra work duty, assigned as punishment. 12 hours in the mine instead of 10, double quota, no break. This wasn't just exhaustion, it was a slow execution. It was known among inmates as the death shift. Many didn't return. Perhaps most horrifying were the denials. If a prisoner was caught speaking ill of the camp, the guards, or, worst of all, the party, they were labeled as a threat to the collective. These prisoners might be handed over to the NKVD for further interrogation, or simply transferred to the worst zones, where survival was next to impossible. Others were executed quietly, without a trial, a bullet behind the ear in a forest clearing, no funeral, no marker. What made the punishments even more unbearable was their unpredictability. You could try to keep your head down, work hard, say nothing, but still find yourself hauled away. There were informants everywhere, prisoners who reported on each other in exchange for food or privileges. You never knew who was listening, or why the guards suddenly called your name. This uncertainty created a kind of permanent psychological pressure. Prisoners didn't sleep deeply, they didn't speak freely. They watched their own thoughts like separatists, because in the Gulag, a single word, even whispered, could cost you your life. And yet, some endured. They found small ways to resist. Secret songs, scratched carvings on bunks, shared crusts of bread, even under threat. These small acts were dangerous, sometimes fatal, but they were reminders of humanity. In a place designed to erase the self, such gestures were a kind of quiet defiance. But the system didn't care about dignity, it didn't care about guilt or innocence. In the Gulag, punishment wasn't about justice, it was about control. In the Gulag, time did not pass in days or weeks, it passed in weight, heavy, suffocating, numbing weight, the kind that settled on your chest at night and crawled into your skull during the day. It wasn't just about surviving hunger or cold, it was about surviving the emptiness inside, the crushing, ever-present silence of being forgotten. For many prisoners, the most dangerous battle wasn't against frostbite or exhaustion. It was the slow erosion of the mind, the unraveling of the self. Every day was the same. Wake before dawn, stand for roll call in the snow, trudge out to labor, return broken, sleep without rest, repeat, again, and again, and again. The sameness of it all gnawed at memory. It blurred days together. Men would forget how long they had been imprisoned. Some even forgot what year it was. The seasons helped a little, the sharp bite of winter, the brief bloom of spring. But soon even that became routine. Days no longer had names, they just were. Letters were rare. For political prisoners, they were often forbidden entirely, and when they did come, they arrived months late, redacted by censors, paragraphs blacked out in thick ink, a wife's words silenced, a child's drawing returned unopened. Some inmates received news of a death in the family with only 2 words stamped on a slip of paper, relative deceased. No explanation, no closure. But worse than the silence from outside was the silence within. Prisoners began to question if they were still the person they remembered. Names lost their weight. Memories became distant, like watching someone else's life from behind glass. Who were you, really, if you didn't have your job, your books, your friends, your mirror? Some tried to resist the mental decay. They repeated poems to themselves, recited whole books they had memorized in youth. A few scribbled invisible letters on their hands in the dark, just to remind their minds how words felt. Others clung to stories, real or imagined, repeating them again and again like prayers, trying to hold on to their own voice in a place built to erase it. But many couldn't hold on. They became what prisoners called oblomki, broken fragments. These were the men and women who stopped speaking, who stared blankly at the sky for hours, who responded to questions with a shrug. They didn't cry or scream. They simply withdrew, folding inward like collapsed tents. You could see it in their eyes. A quiet vacancy, a flickering light dimmed by too many winters. And yet, ironically, it was often the strongest, the most idealistic, the most passionate, who fell hardest. These were the people who had believed in something before the camps, who had spoken out, protested, loved literature or politics or God. In the Gulag, conviction was a liability. Hope became a poison. The more you cared, the harder it was to survive the system's indifference. Even dreams weren't safe. At night, when the cold eased its grip slightly and sleep came in broken waves, the mind played cruel tricks. Some dreamed of home tables filled with food, arms around loved ones, the smell of soil and smoke. Others had dreams of freedom, of walking out of the gates, of being forgiven. These dreams felt so real that waking up was like a second punishment. Many preferred not to dream at all. Suicide was never spoken of directly, but it was understood. A man who stepped too slowly near the mining carts, a woman who wandered too far from the work line during a snowstorm, a slip of the foot, a stumble into the frozen river, a sudden collapse in the quarry. These things happened, too often, and when they did, no ceremony followed, no burial, just a name crossed off, a bunk reassigned. There was no counseling, no healing, no reprieve. If you wept, you did so quietly, face down in your hands, so no one would report you. If you screamed, it was into your own coat. If you laughed, it was often hollow, a bark of madness, or a survival mechanism. Emotion had to be managed like food, rationed, hidden, protected. Some prisoners coped by becoming harder, tougher. They shut down feelings entirely, became cynical, detached. They no longer mourned deaths, didn't ask about birthdays, avoided friendships. It was a kind of armor, psychological insulation from pain. But it came at a price. When the war ended, or the sentence did, and these prisoners returned to their homes, many discovered they had left themselves behind in the taiga. And then there were those who became what the system wanted, obedient hollow shells. They echoed slogans. They reported their comrades. They smiled during roll call, but behind their eyes was a deep, unfillable vacancy. They hadn't just lost themselves, they had been remade. Still, amidst all this, some held on. A teacher who kept a secret diary in scraps of soap wrapper, a priest who murmured prayers in the freezing dark, a poet who whispered verses into the wind. They were rare and fragile, but they existed. Proof that even in the bleakest human experiments, some souls refused to vanish. Because that's what the Gulag really was, an experiment in erasure of identity, of individuality, of memory. And yet, every time a prisoner remembered their mother's lullaby, or taught a fellow inmate a song, or simply said their own name aloud in the dark, they were pushing back, quietly. In the official records, the Gulag was a system of strict discipline, rigid schedules, and total control. But behind those barbed wires, another world flourished. A shadow economy as vital and complex as any marketplace in Moscow or Leningrad. It was here, in hushed conversations and hidden exchanges, that prisoners found ways to endure. Everything in the camp had value. Everything could be traded. Food was the highest currency, of course. A crust of bread, a few spoonfuls of porridge, or a scrap of dried fish could buy nearly anything. But other items had their place, a cigarette or a matchstick, a piece of soap, a needle, a button, a strip of cloth, a usable nail, a belt, even a shoelace. These humble objects were often worth more than rubles or promises. The black market was built on necessity. The camp administration might issue 1 bar of soap every few months, but lice and dirt spread daily. You might get boots, but not a belt. A hole in your trousers could mean frostbite. A missing glove could cost fingers. So prisoners traded constantly, crafting an unspoken economy out of their desperation. The kitchen was the heart of the black market. Kitchen workers, prisoners themselves, wielded enormous power. A cook could slip a little extra potato into your soup, or skim a ladle for himself. In exchange, he might ask for a favor, a shirt mended, a night on your bunk near the stove, a secret kept. It wasn't generosity, it was survival, and everyone understood. Some prisoners specialized in repairs, patching boots with scraps of leather, sewing tears with horsehair thread, or straightening bent spoons. These artisans became minor celebrities, their services sought after by prisoners and guards alike. A well-mended coat might buy you protection for a week. A new set of laces could earn you a day's worth of bread. Even guards took part. Though officially forbidden, many officers were eager customers of the black market. They de-trade extra rations or warmer uniforms for contraband brought in by prisoners who worked outside the camp fence. Men who might find berries, mushrooms, or small game in the forests. Guards sometimes sold letters from families, holding them hostage until a prisoner offered enough in return. Other times they'd sell favors. A kinder work assignment, a better bunk, or a warning about a surprise inspection. Theft was a dark part of this economy. It was dangerous but common. A careless prisoner might wake to find his hat gone, or his bread ration stolen during roll call. Such losses could be deadly. Desperate men watched one another with predatory eyes, calculating who seemed weakest, who might not fight back, who wouldn't be missed if they starved. This constant tension made every night in the barracks a game of vigilance. And yet, even in this cutthroat market, there was a strange solidarity. Older prisoners sometimes took pity on the newcomers, teaching them what prices were fair, who could be trusted, and who would steal them blind. A man who'd survived a decade in the camps knew things: how to preserve a candle stub, how to hide a needle, how to barter with a kitchen hand without getting caught. Sharing this knowledge was a gift more precious than bread. Women's camps had their own versions of the black market. Needles, fabric, and thread were prized. Embroidered handkerchiefs could be traded for food. A secret lipstick or a comb could make a woman feel human again, even in the coldest barrack. Such items passed hand to hand like sacred relics, keeping a flicker of femininity alive where everything conspired to extinguish it. Rumors often spread of large caches of food or contraband hidden by prisoners or corrupt guards. These tales kept hope alive, but also led to dangerous searches, betrayals, and sudden violence. The promise of a hidden sack of flour or a stolen sack of sugar could set the entire camp buzzing with anxious excitement or fearful paranoia. The black market also dealt in news, perhaps its most important commodity of all. A scrap of newspaper smuggled in by a transport guard, a whispered update about the war, a rumor of amnesty or a shift in Stalin's inner circle. These morsels of information were priceless. They gave prisoners something beyond the camp's fences, a reason to keep hoping, or sometimes a reason to despair. To the outside world, the Gulag was silent, uniform, and orderly. But within, it pulsed with barter and negotiation, a hidden society that neither the guards nor the state could fully control. This underground economy was not just a way to survive physically, it was a declaration. Prisoners were still human beings, capable of choices, desires, cunning, and even generosity, because in the black markets whispered deals and secret trades. Prisoners carved out a sliver of freedom, proof that, even when stripped of everything else, a person could still resist by wanting, by bargaining, and by finding ways to help one another. Of all the punishments a Gulag prisoner could endure, the hunger, the cold, the brutal labor, none was more feared than the dreaded kaza, the punishment cell, known simply as solitary confinement. Unlike the violence of the camps, which was loud and immediate, the cruelty of solitary was quiet, slow, and strangely intimate. The kaza was typically a small, dark cell no bigger than a closet. Made of brick or wood, sometimes stone, it was designed not to punish the body through force, but to unmake the prisoner from the inside out. In the bitterest regions of Siberia, these punishment cells were unheated. The floor might be covered with water or bare ice. A small barred opening near the ceiling, if there was one, allowed only a faint hint of daylight, and no warmth at all. Prisoners were sent to solitary for all kinds of offenses: stealing a scrap of bread, talking back to a guard, refusing to work, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The rules were vague, and the authorities arbitrary. Some ended up in the kaza for defending a fellow inmate. Others went because they'd been denounced in secret. Inside, there was usually nothing but the floor. No bed, no blanket. If a prisoner was lucky, they might be given a wooden bench or plank. Meals were reduced to starvation rations, often a slice of bread and some hot water, if that. Sometimes, they weren't fed at all. Time in solitary ranged from a day to a month, but even a few nights could break the spirit of the strongest man. And then came the cold. In winter, temperatures inside the casa could fall below -30°C -22°. If prisoners would pace in tiny circles or stamp their feet endlessly, just to keep blood flowing to their toes. Some would recite poetry or sing quietly, over and over, anything to preserve their minds. But for many, isolation began to unravel reality. Hallucinations weren't rare. The sound of footsteps outside the door might be imagined. One might think they heard their name whispered from the walls. Time ceased to exist. Prisoners often lost count of days. Without sunlight or conversation, they couldn't tell morning from evening. The brain became disoriented, then paranoid. A man might start to believe he was being watched, judged, or even forgotten. Others began talking to themselves or reliving old memories out loud. It was said by many survivors that solitary didn't just punish, it erased. Some tried to fight back mentally. They would count bricks, or trace patterns in the wood grain, inventing elaborate mental games. One man imagined playing entire games of chess in his head, piece by piece, turn by turn. Another practiced foreign languages he'd learned in school decades earlier, muttering declensions and verb tenses like a lifeline. These tricks kept the mind engaged, a desperate defense against unraveling. In rare cases, prisoners carved messages into the walls, names, dates, prayers. Some left marks to count the days, others scratched crude portraits, as if trying to prove that a person had once existed there. These etchings, faint and hidden in the dark, were quiet acts of defiance. Memories made solid in a place designed to erase them, but not everyone made it out whole. Some emerged from solitary unable to speak, their eyes unfocused, their movements slow and mechanical. Others returned to the barracks speaking gibberish or refusing to sleep, and some, tragically, died inside, frozen in corners, curled into themselves like broken dolls. When a casa cell was finally opened, the stench of unwashed bodies, waste, and decay could be overwhelming. Guards would sometimes wait days to check on the occupant. In women's camps, solitary confinement was no less cruel. Women were often locked away for minor transgressions like weeping openly or trying to write a letter in secret. Inside they suffered the same silence, the same cold. Some scratched lullabies into the wood, others whispered names of children they would never see again, over and over, as if repetition might bring them closer. And still, amidst the darkness, a strange resilience sometimes stirred. To survive solitary was to claim some fragment of the self, a memory that couldn't be taken, a phrase remembered, a line of poetry still intact. Prisoners who endured the casa came back thinner, quieter, changed, but sometimes, not broken, just harder, more focused, as if the experience had burned away weakness, leaving behind something sharper. The casa was meant to break the spirit, to silence the voice, erase the self. But as many survivors recalled, even in the most silent darkness, the mind found ways to resist. A whisper of a memory, a rhythm tapped out on the wall, a name repeated like a prayer. In that isolation, many prisoners discovered just how much strength it took, not just to survive, but to remember who they were. In the world outside the barbed wire, illness was something you confronted with care. You went to a doctor, maybe got a hot meal or a few days of rest. But inside the Gulag, sickness wasn't a temporary hardship. It was a sentence within a sentence, often worse than the original one that sent you there. Because in the Gulag, falling ill didn't mean help. It often meant abandonment. Each camp had its own medpunkt or infirmary, a small room or wooden shack designated for treating the sick. But to call these places clinics is misleading. Most were barely cleaner than the barracks. No heating, no reliable sanitation, windows that didn't close. Beds, if there were any, were wooden planks. In some, patients lay on bare floors or on piles of rags, shivering, sweating, moaning quietly in corners. The supplies, tragically sparse. There were no antibiotics, no painkillers. Bandages were often reused, washed in cold water and hung to dry. Syringes were shared between dozens of patients. Sometimes the only medicines were chalk powder, aspirin, or iodine. If morphine or sulfur drugs were available, they were usually reserved for guards or political elites. The medical staff, often undertrained, some were real doctors, political prisoners who had once practiced medicine, but they had no tools, no support, and barely any hope. Others were felchers, low-level paramedics with minimal training. and in many cases, the doctor was just another prisoner, assigned the role with no qualifications at all. In one camp, a barber became the chief medical attendant. In another, a woman who had once sold vegetables at a market stitched wounds with thread taken from clothing. To be seen in the medpunkt was not necessarily a relief. First, you had to be allowed to go, and the guards were reluctant. If you could still stand, still breathe, still lift a shovel, you were told to keep working. Complaints were seen as laziness or rebellion. Many prisoners, even with high fevers or open wounds, were forced to report to the labor zone, lest they be accused of malingering, a punishable offense that could land them in solitary or cost them their food rations. So prisoners learned to hide their pain, broken ribs, infected cuts, frostbitten toes. These were ignored or concealed, endured in silence. The fear of being labeled a faker was greater than the pain itself. Some inmates went to incredible lengths to keep working, tying splints from sticks, biting down on leather during seizures, or binding bleeding feet in stolen cloth. Because being weak in the camp was dangerous in every sense of the word, if a prisoner was lucky enough or unlucky enough to be admitted to the medpunkt, they were often met not with compassion, but with indifference. There were too many patients, too few supplies, and a crushing sense of hopelessness. Doctors, once noble professionals, became numb. They had no tools, no hope of healing, just triage, the art of deciding who might live and who would simply be left to fade away. Diseases flourished. Tuberculosis ran rampant in the cramped barracks, especially in the winter when ventilation was poor. Dysentery and typhus were constant threats due to contaminated water and poor hygiene. Scabies, lice, and fungal infections became everyday companions, and when a serious injury occurred, a crushed hand from machinery, a deep gash from a logging accident, amputation was often the only option. There were stories of legs removed with saws and no anesthetic. Prisoners held each other down, stuffed rags in mouths to muffle screams, and prayed to pass out before it was over. Some camps maintained cemeteries for the dead, others dumped bodies in mass graves, or left them in the forest to be buried by snow and time. Medical records were rarely kept, and when they were often falsified. Cause of death: heart failure, pneumonia, or simply expired. No mention of the months of untreated suffering that preceded it. Women suffered doubly. In many camps, there was no provision for maternal care. Pregnant prisoners worked until they couldn't stand. Births took place in cold rooms or in bunks, with no clean linen, no sterile tools. Stillbirths were common, and if a baby survived, it was often taken from the mother, sent to an orphanage, or sometimes left to die. The anguish of childbirth under such conditions was both physical and emotional. A few women performed abortions on themselves or one another, using sharpened twigs, broken spoons, or boiling water. The survival rate was low, and yet, in the midst of this horror, there were still glimpses of humanity. A prisoner doctor might give away his own ration to a feverish patient. A felcher might risk punishment to steal a bit of gauze or sugar from a guard's supplies. Patients held each other's hands, they whispered stories, shared memories, died together, not alone. There was a silent brotherhood in those clinics, an understanding that even when the system had turned its back, the human spirit might still lean forward. To be sick in the Gulag was not just to suffer physically, it was to stare down a wall of indifference and find a way, somehow, to remain human in the face of it. And for those who survived, the memory of that struggle, the smell of the medpunkt, the low groans in the dark, the touch of a stranger's hand on a fevered forehead, never faded. When we picture the Soviet Gulag, our minds often conjure rows of gaunt, hollow-eyed men hauling logs through frozen forests or chipping stone from a quarry. But women, too, were sent to the camps by the tens of thousands, wives of so-called enemies of the people, accused spies, dissidents, peasants, nuns, and even teenagers. Their crimes were often as trivial as writing a joke about Stalin or owning a few extra kilograms of grain. Once arrested, they were swept into the same vast machinery of punishment and oblivion, but their experience in the Gulag came with unique, haunting dimensions. For many women, the journey to the camps began in darkness. Arrests happened in the middle of the night. Boots on stairs, a knock, the shouts of the NKVD. They were given only minutes to pack, often dragging children from their beds as the men with rifles waited. Some never saw their families again. Others were imprisoned together, mother and daughter crammed into the same cattle car, bound for a nameless stretch of wilderness. Upon arrival at the camps, women were assigned labor just as the men were. They worked in logging teams, construction brigades, road gangs. They carried bricks, hauled sacks of cement, cleared snow in sub-zero temperatures. The work was grueling. the hours long, the food insufficient. And yet the cruelty didn't stop at labor. The women's barracks were no haven. Overcrowded, lice-ridden, and freezing in winter, they offered no privacy or protection. Here, in the flickering light of a single bulb, women tried to survive. Physically, emotionally, and sometimes maternally, menstruation was a monthly misery. There were no sanitary products, no private washing areas. Women bled into rags torn from old clothes or nothing at all. They washed with ice water, in rivers, or not at all. Humiliation was constant, but the darkest shadow hanging over women in the Gulag was sexual violence. Some guards treated the female barracks as a hunting ground. Women were propositioned, threatened, and assaulted. Some were forced into sexual relationships in exchange for food, extra blankets, or medicine. Others were simply taken. There were no consequences for the abusers, and no refuge for the victims. Pregnancies occurred. If a woman became visibly pregnant, she might be transferred to a maternity zone if one existed, but often there was no care, no help. Some gave birth on their own, in cold corners of the barracks, surrounded by fellow prisoners. Others gave birth while still forced to work. Some babies survived, many did not. And if the baby did live, it was often taken away. In some camps, children stayed with their mothers for 2 years before being sent to state orphanages. Most never saw their mothers again. Female prisoners also suffered in subtler ways, the psychological erosion of dignity and identity. Many were intellectuals, artists, teachers, mothers. In the camps, they were reduced to numbers. Their hair was shaved. They were forced to wear shapeless clothes, stripped of femininity. For some, this loss was as painful as the physical labor. And yet, as in all corners of the Gulag, the resilience of the human spirit persisted. Women found ways to retain a piece of themselves. They made combs out of scrap metal, embroidered flowers onto scraps of cloth with threads pulled from blankets. They memorized poems, sang lullabies, whispered stories to one another in the dark. Friendships formed that would outlast the walls of the camp. In some barracks, women organized secret salons, reciting poetry, telling jokes, or pretending to attend classes. It was theater against despair. There were also acts of quiet defiance. A woman might smuggle a crust of bread to a sick comrade. Another might slap a guard who made an indecent advance, even if it meant solitary confinement. Some kept journals, scratched into wood or hidden in tiny notebooks, recording the names of the dead so they would not be forgotten. These were not grand revolutions, but they were rebellions of identity, dignity, and memory. The bonds formed between women in the Gulag were unique. They shared stories of their children, of homes now lost, of husbands disappeared. They mourned together, laughed quietly. Sometimes they adopted one another as surrogate family, a younger woman becoming a daughter, an older one a mother. In these makeshift families, there was warmth, protection, and hope, even in the bitterest cold. For the few who survived and were released, the scars endured. Many never spoke of what happened behind the wire. Their stories went untold for decades, buried under shame and trauma. But in recent years, memoirs and testimonies have emerged. Voices long silenced, now bearing witness. To be a woman in the Gulag was to carry a different kind of burden, one not always visible in photographs or statistics. It was to suffer not just through hard labor and hunger, but through invisibility, silence, and the particular cruelties reserved for those whose strength was underestimated. The harsh winds that swept across the Soviet Gulag camps battered not just the body but the mind. If the biting cold, meager rations, and back-breaking labor assaulted the physical self, it was the erosion of the mind that often proved most quietly devastating. Survival in the camps was not just a matter of calories or clothing, it was a psychological struggle against the constant, grinding machinery of dehumanization. And for many, that battle was the hardest of all. From the moment a prisoner arrived at a Gulag camp, the process of psychological dismantling began. Your name was stripped away. In its place, a number. You were no longer a teacher, a soldier, a poet, or a parent. You were just a unit, a laborer. The world outside, your city, your home, your family, was severed completely. Letters from loved ones were rare. News was censored or outdated. The future ceased to exist as anything real. What remained was the monotony of repetition, pain, and fatigue. Prisoners developed what came to be known as the camp mentality. Each morning, you woke with one goal. Survive today. Don't think about tomorrow, or next year, or parole. You walked to the worksite under guard, knowing any moment of resistance could mean death. You performed tasks that were pointless or impossible. You repeated the same meals, watery soup, black bread, and sometimes nothing at all. You endured the same cruelty from guards, the same betrayals from fellow prisoners, the same freezing wind that never seemed to stop. Some inmates broke early. They fell into what other prisoners called camp death, not a physical ailment, but a state of spiritual and psychological collapse. These people stopped speaking, stopped responding. They no longer moved during roll call or sought out food. They simply lay in their bunks, staring. Many died within days. Inmates learned to recognize this condition by the blank, faraway look in the eyes, the soul retreating before the body followed. Others, however, found subtle ways to resist this collapse of the self. They clung to identity, to memory, to habits from their previous life. A former teacher might teach others in the barracks at night, quietly, with a whisper, reciting history lessons or French grammar under blankets to a few curious ears. A pianist might tap out remembered melodies on her thigh or a wooden bench, recreating whole symphonies in silence. An artist might draw faces in the dirt or scratch portraits into scrap metal. A poet might write lines in his head, repeating them nightly so they wouldn't be forgotten, even if there was no paper to write them on. These small acts were not just coping mechanisms, they were rebellions. The camp tried to turn people into tools, into numbers. But to draw, to teach, to remember one's own poems, this was to remain a person. It was to say, I am more than this. Memory itself became a lifeline. Inmates would replay favorite meals, scenes from childhood, a lover's voice, the smell of books, the texture of their mother's coat. The act of remembering became a fortress, an interior life untouched by the mud, the cold, and the guards. Some inmates made it a mission to remember the names of the dead, whispering them like prayers before sleep, so that someone, somewhere, would carry that person's memory forward. Humor also survived, strange and dark though it was. Prisoners developed nicknames for particularly absurd aspects of camp life. They joked about the futility of their labor, about the unpredictable behavior of the guards, about the Kafkaesque logic of Soviet justice. These jokes were rarely loud and never safe. Laughter could get you punished, but they existed. In the bleakest of places, humor flickered like a candle. Relationships, too, played a vital role in psychological survival. Inmates formed friendships, alliances, and surrogate families. An older man might adopt a younger one as a camp son, teaching him how to stay warm, how to stretch out soup for extra calories, how to avoid angering the guards. These human connections were reminders that the camp had not succeeded in making everyone entirely selfish or broken. Still, the mental burden was heavy. Paranoia was common. So was despair. Inmates who had been betrayed by neighbors, co-workers, or even spouses, often obsessed over the injustice. Some wrote imaginary letters to their accusers. Others plotted revenge in their minds for years. Many never received trials. Many never knew what exact accusation had led them here. The arbitrary cruelty of the system left mental wounds that never healed, and yet when amnesties finally came in the 1950s, after Stalin's death and prisoners began to walk out of the camps, aged hollow-eyed and uncertain, many retained one last form of strength, the ability to tell the truth. Some wrote memoirs, some testified, some stayed silent but never forgot. The mind, even when battered, had preserved its store of memory, pain, and humanity. It had carried the story. In the Gulag, survival wasn't just about enduring starvation or cold. It was about protecting the part of yourself that could not be counted, measured, or chained. It was about holding on, in some dark corner of the mind, to a small whisper that said, I am still me. The word freedom carried a strange weight in the Gulag for years. It had been a distant and almost mythical concept, something you whispered about in the cold dark, something that flickered at the edges of dreams. Many prisoners clung to it as a beacon of hope, a light at the end of a long, frozen tunnel. And then, one day it came, not with celebration or trumpets, but with a knock on the barracks door, a name called out, and a quiet command to report to the office. For many prisoners, the release came abruptly. No explanation, no apology, no trial, no verdict overturned. Just a set of worn clothes, perhaps a train ticket, and the hollow declaration, you are free. But freedom, after the Gulag, was not clean or easy. It was complicated, often heartbreaking, frequently disorienting. The world that once had seemed familiar was now alien. The years, sometimes decades, spent behind barbed wire had changed not only the prisoner, but the very landscape of the country they returned to. For one, many former inmates found themselves not truly free at all. The release papers often came with a clause: internal exile. You were no longer imprisoned, but you couldn't return to your home city. You couldn't live near major urban centers. You couldn't take certain jobs. You were, in essence, a ghost on the margins, visible but excluded. Others were technically allowed to go home, but found there was little left waiting. Families had moved on, spouses had remarried, children had grown up not knowing them. In some cases, entire communities had turned against them, suspicious of anyone who had been in the Gulag, assuming guilt, or worse, seeing them as political risks. Employment was another enormous hurdle. Many professions were closed off. A former doctor might be refused hospital work. A former engineer might only be allowed to sweep floors. Even those who found jobs often lived in poverty, their official records stained, their identities forever linked to that invisible brand, former Zek, former prisoner. And there was the mental toll. The world outside was loud, bright, chaotic. Cities pulsed with movement. Trains ran on time. Stores were full of unfamiliar items. For someone who had spent years confined to a strict, monotonous rhythm, the bell, the work brigade, the soup line, the evening count, this freedom felt overwhelming. Some former prisoners compared it to stepping into another universe. Many suffered from what we now might call post-traumatic stress. Loud noises caused flinches, authority figures triggered deep anxiety. Dreams were haunted by guard dogs, by roll calls, by the bitter cold. Some couldn't sleep on soft mattresses. Others hoarded bread under their pillows, unable to shake the instinct that food could disappear at any moment. The habits of survival died hard. Worse still, many felt guilt. Guilt for surviving when others hadn't. Guilt for things done in desperation. Stealing a fellow prisoner's bread. Reporting someone under duress. The Gulag had turned survival into a moral minefield, and freedom offered little absolution. And then there was silence. The Soviet state didn't want to talk about the Gulag. It didn't apologize. It didn't investigate. For decades, it simply pretended it had never happened. There were no reparations, no official acknowledgement, no truth and reconciliation commissions, just a vast silence, a political forgetting. Former prisoners were expected to reintegrate, quietly, without protest or story. Some resisted that silence. A few brave souls began to write, cautiously at first, in hidden notebooks, in samizdat manuscripts, passed hand to hand. Later, after Stalin's death, and especially during the Khrushchev thaw, memoirs began to surface. The most famous, of course, was the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a thunderous chronicle of cruelty, resistance, and memory. But there were others, too. Quieter voices, tender ones, detailed journals, poems written from memory. For many survivors, telling their story became an act of final resistance. If the Gulag had tried to erase them, to reduce them to numbers and labor units, then writing, remembering, was a way to reclaim identity. It was a way to say, this happened, I was there, I lived. Others chose silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they couldn't bear to speak it. The memories were too sharp, the pain too fresh, even after decades. Some never told their children, some never told their spouses. The past sat in their eyes like a shadow, and yet, even in these fractured, difficult returns to life, there were moments of beauty. A former prisoner stepping into the woods alone for the first time, smelling pine trees without a guard nearby. A grandmother peeling potatoes in her own kitchen, not for a quota but for her family. A man holding a newspaper again, reading headlines not chosen for him. A woman watching her daughter get married, a future that had once seemed impossible. Freedom after the Gulag wasn't a single moment, it was a process, a slow, painful thawing, a relearning of the self. For some, it never fully came. But for others, even amid loss and pain, there was a quiet defiance in every step forward. When we imagine the Soviet Gulag, the mental image is often of male prisoners, tired, frostbitten men hauling logs or digging in permafrost under guard towers. But women were there too, in the tens of thousands. Political prisoners, peasants, teachers, secretaries, doctors, wives of enemies of the state, and even young girls barely out of school. They were arrested, interrogated, shipped in cattle cars, and dropped into the same frozen hell, but with the added burden of being women in a system not designed to see them as anything but disposable. For women, the Gulag was not simply a matter of survival against hunger and cold. It was survival against the collapse of identity, against cruelty unique to their gender, and often against a complete erasure of dignity. Interrogations before sentencing were often laced with threats of sexual violence. Some guards carried out those threats, others didn't need to. The fear alone was a weapon. Mothers were arrested in front of their children. Pregnant women were interrogated for hours, standing on swollen feet, threatened with the loss of their unborn child or worse. Pregnancy in the Gulag brought no mercy. In fact, it often brought punishment. Many women tried to hide their pregnancies during intake for fear they'd be sent to worse camps. Others hoped that being pregnant might shield them from hard labor. It rarely did. And when labor came, often prematurely, often in unsanitary barracks or clinic rooms with indifferent or overworked staff, there was no comfort, no warm water, no midwife with a soft hand. In some camps, children born to prisoners were taken away after only a few months. Mothers had to watch strangers carry off their infants, knowing they might never see them again. Some infants died from cold or hunger within days. A few lucky ones were taken in by orphanages. Many simply disappeared into the machinery of the state. Women, like men, were assigned to work brigades. They dug ditches, shoveled snow, hauled bricks, worked in textile factories, or sorted through trash and rubble. The quotas didn't change. If a woman failed to meet her daily work norm, she was punished just the same with reduced rations, isolation, or worse. The heavy labor broke their bodies just as it did the men's. Miscarriages were common. So were joint injuries, frostbite, and chronic illness. But the assault on women wasn't only physical. There was the constant threat of sexual exploitation. Guards, civilian camp officials, even male prisoners in positions of power sometimes demanded favors in exchange for food, protection, or medical care. Some women resisted and suffered, others complied out of desperation. No one should judge them. In the Gulag, morality didn't disappear. But survival often came at a cost. No one should ever be forced to weigh. Still, women adapted. They found pockets of solidarity. In the women's barracks, bonds were formed that helped many survive. Older women taught the younger ones how to patch their clothes, hide food, avoid attention. Stories were shared in whispers. Fairy tales, memories of pre-arrest life, verses of poetry, half remembered. In the pitch black of the sleeping quarters, someone might hum a lullaby, and a barrack full of strangers would be momentarily soothed, transported to gentler places. They celebrated birthdays in secret, perhaps with a crust of bread smuggled from breakfast, or a flower picked from beyond the fence. Women would sometimes use charcoal to draw eyebrows back onto each other's faces, or thread colored string through their collars, finding small ways to reclaim their femininity in a place designed to crush it. Some women wrote, even in secret, poetry scratched into walls, tiny journals hidden in the lining of coats, sewing needles crafted from wire used to stitch words into fabric. Words were weapons. They preserved the self when everything else had been taken. There were artists among them, teachers, doctors who treated others even when they themselves were starving. There were mothers who sang to invisible children in their sleep. There were sisters who shielded one another from guards. There were survivors who never forgot the names of those who didn't return. And there were women who organized protest songs, who stood up to the guards even when it meant a beating, who comforted the dying and buried the dead with whatever dignity they could scrape together from the snow and dirt. After release, women faced particular shame. Some were seen as ruined for having been in prison, or worse, for having been exploited. Many never spoke of their experience again, locked away behind pursed lips and trembling hands. Some never saw their children again. Others spent their lives trying to rebuild what the Gulag had torn apart, and yet they lived, they endured. And in the stories of survivors, it is often the women who are remembered as the quiet center of strength, the ones who mended what was broken, remembered what had been lost, and passed on the truth when the state demanded silence. The story of the Gulag is incomplete without them. Their voices, too often hidden or dismissed, echoes softly through every barrack wall, every worn photograph, every crumpled letter that survived the purge. We spent much time inside the prisoner-s world, among the lice and the frost, the hunger and the hope. But life inside the Gulag wasn't confined to prisoners alone. Someone had to build the fences. Someone had to count the heads. Someone had to unlock the barracks in the morning, shout the orders, hand out the punishments. Someone had to enforce the silence. These were the guards, the commandants, the overseers, the clerks, the armed men on towers, and the petty bureaucrats with rubber stamps. They were human too, and their lives inside the Gulag, while not brutal in the same way as the prisoners, were often soaked in monotony, fear, and moral corrosion. To become a Gulag guard didn't always require ideological zeal. Many were just poor rural boys looking for a stable government job. The NKVD and later the MVD needed men, thousands of them, to staff the ever-growing network of camps. Recruitment campaigns offered housing, a steady income, a uniform, and the illusion of authority. Most guards lived in their own separate quarters, small wooden houses or shared barracks, sometimes fenced off from both the camp and the outside world. They had better food, access to heaters, even radios. Their rations weren't luxurious, but they were consistent. A bowl of kasha, salted fish, black bread, and the occasional meat ration. Some had families who lived nearby, others were young and single, sent far from home to remote corners of the Siberian wilderness. A typical guard's day began early. Roll call for prisoners started before sunrise, and the guards had to be ready, rifles slung, boots laced, eyes alert. They marched the prisoners to the work sites, counted heads again and again, stood watching as men and women dug, lifted, shoveled, or simply collapsed. The guards were not all cut from the same cloth. Some were sadists, brutal, petty tyrants who saw prisoners as subhuman. Others were indifferent, mechanically following orders. A very few, were secretly sympathetic, perhaps even ashamed of their roles. They might sneak an extra ladle of soup to a dying prisoner, or turn a blind eye to small infractions, but kindness could be dangerous. A guard who showed too much leniency might be reported by his colleagues or accused of counter-revolutionary sympathies. Most guards were simply exhausted. The job wore them down. The cold bit at their fingers too. Standing outside all day in 40 below weather wasn't pleasant, even with warm clothes. The boredom was numbing, watching prisoners move rocks or chop wood, day after day, month after month, led some to drink. Vodka flowed whenever it could be found. Fights broke out. Suicide among guards was not unheard of. There was a hierarchy among the staff as well. The commandants, camp bosses, held real power. They decided work assignments, punishments, privileges. Some were former Red Army officers, others were party men, selected more for loyalty than competence. Corruption ran deep. Some commandants ran their camps like little empires, trading favors, hoarding supplies, manipulating prisoner records to look good on reports. Even the guards were being watched. The Soviet system thrived on surveillance, and that extended to its own employees. There were informers among them, secret NKVD agents monitoring the loyalty of the staff. A careless word, a poorly chosen joke, a complaint in the wrong ear. These could lead to arrest, dismissal, or worse. Some guards who once held rifles would themselves end up behind the wire, their former comrades now shouting orders at them. Many guards developed a psychological armor. To survive, they convinced themselves that the prisoners deserved their fate, that they were enemies, wreckers, spies, traitors, or they stopped thinking about it altogether. The people in the barracks became numbers, work units, obstacles, less than real, but not all could hold that line. There are stories of guards who wept at executions, who refused orders and vanished from records, who left the service and never spoke of what they saw. There were women guards too, often assigned to female camps. Some were cruel, others were quiet. A few were prisoners themselves, offered early release in exchange for becoming trustees or camp assistants. These relationships were fraught, blurring the line between oppressor and victim. And so the days turned. Guards ate their meals, wrote letters home, polished boots, received promotions or reprimands. Some formed bonds with fellow guards that lasted years. Others grew hollow-eyed, disconnected, tired of snow and silence and the daily grind of dehumanization. Most were not monsters, but the system didn't require monsters. It only needed ordinary people willing to follow orders, to look the other way, to keep the gates shut and the barracks locked. In this way, the machinery of the Gulag kept turning, not just with the suffering of the prisoners, but with the quiet complicity of those assigned to watch them. The gates may have opened, the barbed wire may have rusted, the camps may have emptied, but the Gulag never truly ended for the people it touched. Long after the last official labor colony closed its doors, the ghost of the system lingered, in families, in minds, in paperwork, in silence. For many prisoners, release didn't feel like freedom. Some were formally freed, but assigned to internal exile, forbidden from returning to major cities like Moscow or Leningrad, forced to live in remote settlements with few jobs and little support. Others were dumped at train stations with a few rubles and no identity documents. Their past still branded them as former enemies, limiting housing, employment, education, and social mobility. They had survived, But survival had cost them dearly. Years lost, families broken, health destroyed, teeth rotted from hunger, hands twisted from frostbite, lungs ruined by cold and coal dust, minds frayed from isolation and fear. Children of former Gulag prisoners were often marked up in Soviet society. Your background mattered. A parent who'd been labeled a counter-revolutionary could quietly doom your future. University applications were denied. KGB files followed you. Even in the 1970s and 80s, some children whispered about their parents in code, afraid that too much honesty could reopen old wounds or attract the attention of the wrong people. And what of the families who never got their loved ones back? For them, the Gulag left only holes, a knock on the door, an arrest in the night, and then nothing. No trial, no letter, no grave. Thousands of wives waited for years, decades, writing letters to Soviet ministries, begging for news. Many died never knowing whether their husbands were alive or buried beneath a numbered stake in frozen permafrost. Even survivors struggled to speak. The trauma was deep, but the fear ran deeper. Talking about the Gulag was dangerous, even after Stalin's death. It wasn't until the late 1980s, during glasnost under Mikhail Gorbachev, that many began to speak openly. Memorial groups formed. Survivors gave interviews. Mass graves were uncovered. Names were read aloud in public squares. Whispered memories made visible at last. Still, the memory of the Gulag remains contested. Some former guards insisted they had done their duty, that the system was flawed, but necessary. Others vanished into civilian life, never speaking of what they saw. The Soviet state never issued broad apologies. Rehabilitation for victims was piecemeal, bureaucratic, often symbolic. A pension here, a certificate there. For many it was too little, too late. And in modern Russia, the memory of the Gulag flickers in and out of focus. Some textbooks mention it in passing. Others glorify Stalin's industrial progress, minimizing the cruelty. Memorial museums exist, but they are few. Historians face pressure. Political leaders invoke Soviet strength while sidestepping Soviet brutality. Some monuments have been built, others remain unfinished, caught in bureaucratic red tape. But the land remembers. Scattered across Russia are the skeletal remains of the camps, wooden watchtowers leaning into the wind, half-buried rails, broken barracks, swallowed by moss and trees. In places like Vorkuta, Magadan, and Norilsk, old foundations still shape the townscape. Entire cities were built on Gulag labor, their streets paved by the footsteps of the condemned. And still, survivors gather. Each year, small groups of aging former prisoners, their children, and human rights activists come together in places like Perm 36, one of the last surviving Gulag camps turned into a museum. They light candles, share stories, remember those who vanished. Some carry yellowed photographs. Others simply stand in silence. Because the Gulag was not only a place, it was a wound inflicted across decades, across millions, across a nation. It was an experiment in control that left deep fractures in the soul of a people. And while the fences may have fallen, the echo remains, in whispered memories, unmarked graves, lost generations, and the quiet resilience of those who, somehow, endured. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a still winter night. The air is sharp, almost motionless. Snow crunches softly beneath heavy boots. The landscape stretches on, endless, blank, silent. Somewhere, far from cities and comforts, wooden barracks lie half buried in snowdrifts. Inside, men and women lie curled on plank beds. Some sleep, others cannot. The cold gnaws. A cough breaks the silence. A whisper is swallowed by frost. This was the quiet of the Gulag, not dramatic or loud, just cold, tired, endless, the kind of silence that seeps into the bones. Now, decades later, that silence still lingers, not just in the ruins of old camps or the footnotes of forgotten books, but in the generational memory of a people who were taught to forget, who were told to be grateful, who were made to believe that suffering had no value unless it served the state. But history has a way of resurfacing, not with a roar but with a whisper, with testimonies uncovered, diaries translated, rusted fences photographed by grandchildren of those once imprisoned. The silence is breaking, and what comes through is not only tragedy, but endurance. And from that endurance, a quiet kind of truth. The Gulag was more than barbed wire and guards. It was a test of systems, of ethics, of the human soul. It revealed how easily institutions can be twisted into engines of dehumanization, how bureaucracy can become cruelty, how fear can be used to make ordinary people do extraordinary harm, or remain passively complicit. But it also revealed something else. It showed us the limits of power. For all its brutality, The Gulag could not destroy the basic humanity of its victims. It could not fully erase dignity, or crush all kindness, or prevent moments of compassion between strangers. Even amid starvation, prisoners shared crusts of bread. They risked beatings to help a sick comrade. They carved poems into walls, scribbled notes in margins, learned foreign languages by whispering vocabulary through cracks in the floorboards. They survived, and survival in this context is not a small word. It is a quiet form of resistance, a statement that a person stripped of rights, family, warmth, and hope could still exist, still think, still dream. Why does this story matter today? Because the machinery of repression rarely announces itself with drama. It begins with whispers, with redefinitions of truth, with the labeling of enemies. It grows through normalization, through laws passed in silence, and doors knocked on at night. The Gulag teaches us that totalitarianism is not only about violence, it is about silence, and how dangerous that silence can become when we grow used to it. To study the Gulag is not to dwell in misery, it is to listen, to honor the memory of those who were forced into the permafrost of oblivion, to speak aloud what they could not, to remind ourselves, and future generations, that freedom is fragile, and memory is sacred. In Russia today, the legacy of the Gulag remains uncertain. Some commemorate, others deny. A few brave historians work to preserve records, activists gather to read names aloud, museums face funding cuts, monuments gather dust, but the truth is still there, in archives, in aging survivors, in the soil of the Arctic, and in the hearts of those who remember. Perhaps the most enduring memorial is not built from stone. It is the act of telling the story, of remembering that beneath every prisoner number was a life, a father, a sister, a teacher, a poet, people who deserved more than a sentence in a file. This, then, is the purpose of boring history told for sleep, not to sensationalize, not to awaken outrage, but to gently cradle the truth, to place it in your hands like a fragile artifact, to say, this happened, and in the stillness of night, to let that knowledge settle quietly in the mind, not to alarm, but to remind, because remembrance is the gentlest kind of justice we can offer to the forgotten. So now, as you lie still, eyes heavy, let the snow fall quietly over the past, let the names linger like breath on cold air, and know that in remembering, we offer something that the Gulag system tried, and failed, to erase: human dignity.